All right. Thank you for joining us today for the Mavenspire Lunch and Learn series. My name is Chris Landers. I'm a solutions consultant here with Mavenspire Incorporated. Today, I'm going to be covering next generation data center processors from both Intel and AMD. As we get into this, just kind of a quick review of the agenda. I'm going to do a quick introduction to both Intel and AMD. We're going to go through some side-by-side comparisons and talk through some of the claims being made by both Intel and AMD. And then we'll transition into some of the supporting technologies around DDR5, PCIe Gen 5, and new drive form factors that are also underlying supporting technologies to the Intel and AMD new generation processors. And then at the end of this, we will quickly go through some of the new Dell and HPE new generation or next generation server models in their mainstream lines. For Dell, it's their 16th generation. For HPE, it's their 11th generation. We'll just kind of quickly go over some of the platforms that they've launched utilizing the new Intel and AMD processor platforms. Jumping in and just starting to look at some of the comparisons here. For Intel, this is their new Intel 4th generation, what they codenamed Sapphire Rapids. And then for the AMD side, it's also their 4th generation data center processor launch around their EPYC line, which they codenamed Genoa. When you look at these things, the first thing that you're going to notice is the cores. So on the Intel side, the new Intel generation supports up to 56 cores per socket per processor. Intel continues to bucketize these into their platinum, gold, and silver ranges. So you can see down here below, these start off with the silver series, which go with the 12 core to 20 core per socket counts. Gold series ranges from 8 core to 32 core. And then their highest end is their platinum series, which goes from 40 core to 56 core. When you look over on the AMD side, you'll notice obviously AMD has made a much larger leap up to 96 cores per processor. They don't really bucketize theirs the same way that Intel does. They're just each processor has its own corresponding model number, but they range from anywhere from as low as a 16 core count up to a 96 core count. That may lead you to believe at face value when you first look at it that there's a much larger benefit when you look at the top end of the core counts, but there are some subtle nuances, and we'll get into that when we talk about some of the supporting technologies around how much memory per socket is supported between the AMD and Intel models. And so there's some trade-offs there. Also on the Intel side, there are some platforms that are 4-socket platforms where AMD are single socket and 2 sockets. So there's some trade-offs there. So don't judge it just simply by looking at the core count. Next is, and this kind of gets into some of the supporting technologies that we'll talk about, but just some of the high-level claims made by both Intel and AMD around memory. This is around the DDR5 memory support. Intel makes claims of 60% increase in performance utilizing DDR5 memory on their platforms. AMD makes claims of about 50% faster performance over their previous generation. Both are supporting new memory bus speeds of 4800. So, and we'll again get into that a little bit more when we talk about some of the supporting technologies. And then getting down to the bandwidth side of this, this is around PCIe Gen 5. You look at, again, high-level claims here from both Intel and AMD. Intel makes claims of 100% faster throughput using PCIe Gen 5 with up to 80 lanes to accommodate different workloads concurrently. You flip over to the AMD side of it, and a similar claim, only difference being up to 128 lanes to accommodate different workloads concurrently. And then you look around relating this to workloads, and this kind of goes back up to the processors per socket, and then incorporating the increased performance of DDR5 and PCIe Gen 5. Obviously, a lot more of a capability when it comes to highly transactional large databases, artificial intelligence, and machine learning workloads. All of these types of workloads are going to benefit more so from the increase in core counts, increase in bus speeds around PCIe Gen 5, and the increase in performance of DDR5 memory. Transitioning into the underlying technologies, we'll start with PCIe Gen 5. When you look at, and if you look over here on the right side of this, you can kind of see, the different generations of PCIe technology and the overall speeds that they were capable of in the past generations compared to the new Gen 5. So when you look at PCIe Gen 5, there is backward compatibility with PCIe Gen 4. You're now getting up to 30 gigatransfers per second capabilities versus PCIe Gen 4 at 16. And when we go into the next slide, you'll see here, you basically see that generational shift going all the way back to Gen 1. Basically, every time a new generation of PCIe platform comes out, you're doubling and stair-stepping up on the speeds. And so you go all the way back to 2001 and kind of follow the trajectory up here. Every time they've released a new generation, the capability doubles, and they project, obviously going forward beyond PCIe Gen 5, that will continue to be the trend. You look at the different technologies that benefit from a higher capability around the PCI bus, NVMe drives, GPUs, NIC cards, basically anything on the chipset, any kind of PCIe cards, and the transit of information going between them and the processors and the memory. Obviously, the higher end PCIe Gen 5 bus gives you a lot better capability transfer rates between those different components on the chipset. DDR5 memory, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about on the earlier slides, comparing AMD and Intel. Obviously, again, you look at the AMD having the higher core count per socket, but you'll notice here when you look at DDR5, you've got some differences over here on the right side between what Intel supports per socket and what AMD supports per socket. So in Intel platforms, you're going to be able to support up to 4-socket servers using 64 DIMMs. In their 2-socket platform, you can put up to 32 DIMMs, and then the single-socket platform is 16. A little bit of a difference when you look at the AMD processors here with their 2-socket servers supporting 24 DIMMs, single socket at 12 DIMMs. So again, kind of going back to the don't just blindly look at higher cores equals better. There are some trade-offs depending on what kind of workload you're putting on the server. Where if you've got a more processor core intensive workload that's less memory dependent, maybe the AMD is a better option there. But if you've got something that is less dependent on maybe overall core count and could utilize more memory per core, there's where the trade-off is. So it's you might go one way or the other based off of the demands of the workload. The last supporting technology here that we'll talk about is new drive form factors. Obviously, if you think about the history of drive form factor, the most common that you would think of at this point would be what's in the most recent generation of server platforms, which would be the standard 2.5-inch drive form factors. And then obviously there's still some usage of the old 3.5-inch drive form factors. With the new EDSFF E3 drive form factor, and that's the enterprise and data center standard form factor, we now have 4 new versions of this. The biggest call out, and I don't think I've got anything on here calling this out, but one of the big call outs with this drive form factor is that when you look at whether it's Dell, HPE, Lenovo, in these server form factors, there's no longer the need for drive carriers. They've actually gotten rid of the drive carriers. And so now when you go to add drives, you're not going to have to worry about going and separately purchasing or worrying about, do you actually have the appropriate drive carrier? As long as the next generation server that you've acquired has support for these drives, the drives just slide right in without the use of a drive carrier. You can see here, and again, this relates back to what we talked about around PCIe Gen 5. It's just some of the overall claims on the increase in drive performance with the new form factor. 100% increase in sequential reads, 62% increase in sequential writes, 60% improvement in random writes, 33% improvement in random reads. So overall, probably a little bit overdue. When you look at down here, I know this is a little bit hard to read, but when you look here on the slide, this actually the E35 here on the right-hand side of this graphic is the one that is going to pretty much be standardized across at least HPE and Dell from what I've researched so far. So these are the ones that you'll see come in those form factors. Some of these others, I would assume we will probably start to see those adopted as you see some of the storage platforms transition over. So I could see potentially there being some use of these other drive form factors within the family as those product portfolios kind of suss out over time. And then real quick, we'll go through some of the new mainstream servers being released by Dell and HPE. This will be a high-level overview of their initial offerings and their mainstream rack portfolios. Just as we go through this is not the complete vision of what will end up being their full next generation portfolios, but more of a focus on what they have released to sell as of today, where that you can actually go out and buy. Starting with Dell Technologies, again, these are their Gen 16 mainstream rack servers. You'll see here that they have initially launched the next generation in pretty much every standardized form factor they have in their rack family. So you've got 2U 2-socket in the R760. Over here, you've got another variant of the R760XA, which is a 2U 2-socket. There's some differences between these two platforms with regards to drive configurations and drive options. You've got obviously the standard mainstream 1U single socket server. There's also supports dual. This is actually mislabeled as single socket and dual socket capability. They also have launched in their 4-socket form factors. You've got a 4U 4-socket in the R960 and a 2U 4-socket in the R860. The difference between these two models, other than how much rack space they take up, in the R960, obviously you've got more chassis room here to add in additional GPUs. There are more robust drive configurations where you can have more drives versus the R860. So just again, both 4-socket platforms, just obviously a little bit more support for memory, GPUs, and additional drives in the R960 versus the 860. On the AMD side for Dell Technologies, they've initially launched these 4-rack servers. You've got 2 of the 2U models in the R7625 and the R7615. The difference between these two being one is a 2U 2-socket. The next one is a 2U single socket. The 2U single socket platform has a little bit more room for additional GPUs. You look at the 1U offerings, you've got a 1U single socket and a 1U 2-socket offering. Jumping over to HPE, again, these are their initial launches on the Intel side. You got the DL320 1U single socket, the DL360 1U 2-socket, and then the DL380, which is a 2U 2-socket server. And then they have 4 additional servers here. The ProLiant DL345 2U single socket, and then they also have a variant which is a 2U 2-socket. Again, the difference between these, similar to the Dell side, is the single socket version of the 2U server has more room for things like additional GPUs. And then down here you have the DL325 and DL365. The 325 being a 1U single socket and the 365 being a 1U 2-socket. And that concludes today's presentation. I will open it up to Q&A for anybody that has any questions. If you raise your hand, I will open your mic.
Hey, Chris,
Yes,
if you can
sir.
hear me. How do you see, like, we have these new processors and they clearly have more cores. How do you see that playing out in terms of, where people might really consider the 1U1 socket, or, it used to be kind of, even if you only used one socket, make sure you buy the two socket board just in case you ever needed the other one. You
Yeah.
know, how's that going to play out now with AMD having up to like 96 cores per socket and the extended cores? Do you think people can get away with one socket and be totally fine, or do you think that's still transitional?
Well, a couple of things there, and we didn't really talk about it in the presentation materials. Um, what you've got me thinking, and the way you asked that question, is software licensing. One of the things that you do have to think about and be careful about is right sizing. I know if you think back to, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years ago, more is always better. And so, if buy all the extra horsepower you can afford, you have to be a little bit careful, when you think about it, from that perspective. The way you ask the question is like, okay, should I go ahead and get a two socket and just have that extra compute power there ready to go? You have to be careful with, when you think about the caveats around, I'll use Microsoft as an example. If you think about Microsoft Windows Server licensing and some of the per core rules around that, and that's just one example. There's a lot of different software vendors out there that are starting to shift more into that model where they're looking at the core counts, and sometimes maybe it's okay if you're just assigning a certain amount of resources, you can get away with that. But there's a lot of them now switching over to, if it sees that many cores, you better be licensed for that many cores. So again, getting back to whenever you're actually putting things together and making a decision on, do I get that extra processor? Do I bump up and go up, for example, to, hey, I've decided to buy one of the AMD platforms, for example, with 96 cores in it. Besides the fact that that's going to be a pricey option, it's okay. Do you want to, also model up your software licensing to account for 96 cores in a single socket? And do you actually need it, at the end of the day? So it's probably more important ever to have your workloads analyzed and make sure that we're right sizing it, not just generically shifting into a focus on buying as much as we possibly can. Did that answer your question?
Sure did, but your prize for answering is another question.
Great.
So, I've been tracking the rise of composable computing, and I know some of the technologies out there, like those from like Liquid and even a few others, actually use PCI as the fabric to create, dynamically these physical servers or these really high-end floating point dependent processing units. When you started talking about PCI Express version 5, it kind of looked like from the graph that we're talking about the difference between 4 and 5 is maybe a doubling, maybe even a tripling of the bandwidth available. And people are rushing in to take advantage of things like new drive form factors and such. But when you talk about composable computing, where you're interconnecting, different servers to make one big physical server, or you're hooking up 20 GPUs over a PCI switch, like how do you think that's going to play out in terms of the wider highway versus what you could possibly do with it?
Michael, you just stumped me. Um, that's something I think that's something I would need to ramp up on and get back to you with. I think it's definitely a great question, especially when you talk about PCI switches and so forth. So that's definitely something I think we could do a deeper dive on and come back with a little bit more intelligent response than what I'm giving you right now, which is honestly, I don't know. that something I can get back to you on, Michael?
Oh, definitely. I was giving you the silent treatment. I was just waiting to see who else jumped in.
Yeah. Any other questions out there? All right. Well, with that, oh, Mike McBride just raised his hand. All right, Mike, your mic should be open.
Yeah, I guess the one question that I'm curious on is how the pricing has been influenced from this side, and also maybe how that pricing is influencing on the software side. Are we seeing prices fundamentally drop on the whole based on the availability of output on the system side, and conversely, are we seeing the prices go up on the software side because of the capability of the same output? I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to the initial answer I had for Michael's first question. I mean, when you look at, I guess, just the overall cost of on the hardware side of it, obviously there's been impacts over the last few years from a supply chain perspective. I think that, based off of feedback I'm hearing, some of that has alleviated a little bit, but overall, a lot of the price increase around components that we've seen happen over the last 2 to 3 years, it's some of it's here to stay. And then on the software side of it, I would say it is fair to say, again, kind of going back to the example of, or not maybe going back to the example of Microsoft, but maybe talking about the example of what are companies like VMware going to do. With VMware in the midst of being acquired by Broadcom, there's a lot of, I guess you could call it, FUD out there in the industry right now, with concern around, what is VMware going to do? And obviously, when you think about virtualization, I don't have the specific numbers off the top of my head, but I think VMware owns something around, what, 70% of the install base of virtualization platforms right now across the industry. There's a lot of fear around what is Broadcom going to do with the licensing model for VMware after the acquisition. Right now, there's a fairly straightforward licensing model, but if they get into a licensing model that now we're counting and licensing off every single core, again, going back to the example of high core count processors across multiple sockets, you could find yourself in a situation where, if you don't size it the right way, you're going to have 80% compute headroom, and you might think that's great, but you're going to pay for it on the licensing side, because even whether you're using it or not, that licensing has to be in place and paid for. And so you could end up costing yourself more money on the back end. So it's something you definitely have to balance based off of the solution from a hardware perspective, as well as all of the software components that are going to run on it, from the virtualization hypervisor to the guest operating systems, and then the applications that are running within those guest operating systems.
Yeah, I guess that drives a lot of the need for much more robust reviews of your requirements before you start procurement, right? And that's what I'm kind of looking at, is that the softwares are changing dramatically, the hardware enablements are changing dramatically. Both are going to continue to shift. And it just feels like, if as you're looking at the impact, if you're not doing a really good due diligence on what is required versus what you might want, the cost could probably, send you in quite a tailspin if you're not prepared for
Yeah.
it. So that makes sense.
And
okay.
Yeah, and obviously that's something that we here at Mavenspire look at, and focus on anytime that we're trying to help you get to an outcome, and actually deploy this in your data center. It's something where we're going to look very closely at and understand exactly what is it that you're trying to get to, and what you're trying to achieve, and making sure that we're again, kind of going back to the example of don't focus on buying as much as you can afford, but more intently on right sizing it and putting the right scenario in place, so that you're, not running into caveats or hiccups later on down the road where suddenly the Microsoft police or somebody like that shows up to evaluate your licensing, and all of a sudden you get a bigger bill from them because you're out of compliance. So it's something that we've definitely worked through with our customers, just kind of looking at what's your workload going to look like, and what's the best way to right size this and license this. And so that's definitely something that we make sure and help you with along the way.
That sounds good. Good insights. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, I don't see any more hands raised. I don't think I see anything in the chat. All right, well, I hope that this presentation was useful to you. If you would like a one-off and more of a deep dive into the technology, we're definitely here to do that for you. So consider Mavenspire your source. With that, I'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.